Wonderful, thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the special convening of the pre-5-year forecast before the board meeting. I really do appreciate all the help and assistance in preparing this document in unprecedented time. To say that this is one of the more challenging budgets I've ever put together would be a colossal understatement. And districts around Ohio, the legislature, General Assembly are all trying to make crystal ball decisions, as the superintendent says it best, without having all the information. And I found myself a lot going through assumptions and double checking and triple checking and questioning, and I'm hoping that you do the same. You do the same for me, you do the same for our community, and we really challenge these assumptions. All that being said, I have every intention of updating this forecast on a monthly basis. Normally the forecast is submitted to the Department of Education twice a year in October, November, and in May. May is called the update. This is far, far from an update, in my opinion. We will likely be resubmitting the forecast as soon as we get additional CARES Act information, state budget reduction, and staffing concerns as we enter a period of deficit spending. So that's my intro before I get started. Any questions before I get going? And please, like what we did last week, stop me during the presentation. This isn't going to be the formal presentation like it is tonight. I'll be asking for your input. If you'll notice throughout today and tonight, your input from last week is going to be really helpful in crafting that message. So any quick updates before we get started? I'm going to take over the screen, entire screen, and can everyone see the 5-year forecast PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. And I'll keep the slide master to the left of the screen so that you can see it. I have a revised presentation purpose tonight, and hopefully that reflects many of your comments and questions from last week. Again, we can strengthen this even for tonight, and I'm sure that in light of COVID-19, our budget impacts, future levy, this will be taken on the roadshow, or components of it will at some point in the future. So this is only the start of this conversation, I know. So tonight we're going to detail the purpose of the 5-year forecast. I will not do that in detail right now, but I will show you a document that I've highlighted for a little bit of the presentation. And this is how to read a 5-year forecast that the Department of Education produces. It talks a little bit about the purpose. I've highlighted that here in the middle of your screen. It talks about what the statutory requirements are. I'll spend a little bit more time, since we have 4 new board members, just strengthening the ultimate purpose for this. It is not only the financial planning tool for the document, it's a legal backing to all of our contracts. Obviously, the largest of those contracts are our negotiated agreements. And we need to talk about those negotiated agreements. It would be, in all likelihood, districts around the state of Ohio are having conversations with their bargaining groups and are most likely going to have to entertain some type of MOUs before the full financial impact of COVID-19 is felt. So we'll talk a little bit about the purpose tonight. We will talk about the review of revenue and expense trending, kind of the response to COVID-19, what we do know, what we don't know. And as of right now, and this was a big undercurrent, a big undertone from our questions from last week, what are the practical implications to me, to you, to our community, to our students. And again, we're framing in terms of the finance and operations side of the equation. I think all those conversations that you have, that you bring forward, are really important. So to stimulate some of that, let me highlight some of the unique circumstances, and this is more of like what you'll see tonight in the presentation. So on the left side of this PowerPoint, you see 2019 and fast forward to 2024, representing the 5 years of the forecast. What does our general revenue and sources look like? Just to give you some perspective, real estate is about 30% of our revenue, and the combined restricted and unrestricted state funding is about 60% of our revenue. And as you know, we've talked about property values, and with an upcoming reappraisal, we were hoping for some additional gains in reappraisal, which we will likely see. But it's our first real growth since 2008, when we had the real estate and global economic crisis then. So the only growth that we've received over the previous 5 years and projected for the next 5, minus a little bit of growth in real estate, is state funding. And so right in the crosshairs of that, we have COVID-19, and we have unprecedented setbacks at the state of Ohio for sales, income tax, and auto tax, which are the 3 largest funders of the state budget. And those will definitely have an impact on that 60% of our revenue. To the chart to the right, you see our 5-year historical average annual dollar change or trend. Again, we get lost in the spreadsheets, and that's what I do best. But if you look down at the bottom, leading up to today, looking back 5 years, if everybody can see where my cursor is, we've received on average annual growth rate in revenue of about 2.6%. Good questions to ask here is, well, what's CPI? What's inflation? Typical inflation had been 3% prior to 2008. What does it look like? On average, I would say 2.6% was not keeping up with inflation. Knowing that we didn't have real property growth during that time since 2008, and the only growth that we were receiving was state aid.
Hey, Ryan. So, for example, do we know what the CPI was over the same period?
We certainly can. Take some notes here. Last 5 years.
But I think you're right. I think it's greater than 2.6%. So.
Yeah. Just looking at the U.S. Treasury, but I'll go back and see if I can get the CPI for the last 5 years as a point of reference. So the big question mark, and again, where my cursor is located now, where you see 1% growth projected for the next 5 years. I'm not so concerned about the far right column, but that projected average annual growth for the next 5 years, we are estimating to be a cumulative 1%. Or I'm sorry, to average annual 1%. That's a substantial setback. And throughout the presentation, we're going to be talking about what kind of budget reductions are we going to see from the state. So there's lots of assumptions in this. This forecast only reflects the budget reduction that we've received from the state so far. By and large, that's what the majority of our colleagues around the state of Ohio are doing, because we are, I would say, if we were plus or minus a few percent of each other, even the large 8 districts, where we could say, yes, we think we're going to get a 5% cut, then I would have put a 5% cut in the forecast. And back to my earlier comments, that's why I'm certain we will be updating this forecast in the coming months and publishing it again. And it's a great reason to engage our community stakeholders in the General Assembly, as we do know that. I want to make that evidently clear that this forecast only assumes the 3.5% cut. If we move on, I know we talked a little bit about enrollment, but that enrollment in bright spot. And here's some notes that I added from last week on enrollment as you kind of take in that chart since 2007. We were educating in district 26,000 kids and now just under 21,000. There is some general consensus thought that we may get an influx of students as sometime early this week, we are going to see the state announce budget reductions for charter, community, and electronic schools. There's some thought that their cash positions are not as stable as K-12 counterparts, and that there may be further closures of which we've seen over the past 3 to 5 years. There may be further closures of those charter and community schools, thus an influx of students to us. But what are the practical implications of that as we use that filter from last week? The practical implication of that is in most of our buildings and clusters without COVID-19, we are running around 80%, a little bit higher capacity utilization, which the board's worked really hard on that. And that for the most part, we could take those new students on. There are some buildings and clusters that we'd have to work through.
Hey, Ryan, I'm sorry. You said that we were running as a district at what percentage capacity?
About 80 to 85%.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. And maybe for future finance committee, we can get into the detail of that. The board worked really hard on that over the last 15 years to kind of right size its footprint. And this is really important as we get into more of the practical operations components of this discussion. And so we may get an influx of those students, and at least for the short term, how do we educate those students? Do those students provide additional revenue? What's the state formula like in that scenario? All of which are great and reasonable questions. I can get lost in all those answers right now, but the quick answer is any additional student to us will not produce additional revenue. The state, we were working hard on House Bill 305 last year, and with the new governor, there was a frozen formula.
Hey, Ryan, I don't think I quite follow that part.
Yeah.
You said that even if we get additional students, that it would not result in additional state funds. I guess I don't follow that.
So prior to fiscal 20, in this new leadership in office, there was a formula that was student-based. A lot of people are thinking that we're still under that formula, which was called ADM, or average daily membership. Counted every resident student, and it gave you a per pupil state share adjusted amount. Our amount's like $3,800. And then as students would leave, your formula would be detracted. Students would come in, you would get that additional $3,800 from the state. Not quite sure exactly why the governor and budget management decided to freeze the formula, but for the start of this school year, they in a sense put every district on a guarantee. Remember early presentations, we said 80% of the districts weren't on a formula, which was one of the reasons we were going after House Bill 305. Now 100% of the districts are not on a formula. We are all on a guarantee. What it says is fiscal 19, whatever you got in fiscal 19, you will not go below. That's called a guarantee. So what's interesting about that is now districts are really starting to pay attention to it. Those districts that have increasing enrollment are most at harm because they're increasing, their costs are increasing for staff prior to COVID-19, and they're not getting any additional revenue, which could be our case too with the closure of community and charter schools. The districts that were not clamoring about this were districts that had historical average declining enrollment. So our revenue was being propped up while we had a reduced student base. So it is a very serious implication for the state as it talks about a future formula. So correct, if we get 10 students, 20 students, or 200 students from any closures of charter and community, we will not get additional revenue. All right, let's talk about spending side of the equation. And then I'll pause, we'll kind of reflect on this section, and then talk about the response to COVID-19. So similar chart to the left where you see salaries and benefits. Let's total those up just so you have that relative idea, just like what we did in the revenue side. I want to get you an accurate percentage. Let me come back to that one. I've got another screen up to the side. Hold on. So our personnel is running about 50% of our general fund expenditures, and our benefits are running about 22%. I'm sorry, about 20% of this fiscal year. So just at 71%, rounding up, equates to our salaries and benefits. And a reminder, I know we talked a little bit last week, but our purchase service makes up a large portion of that in the gray area of that chart. And I want to get that percentage so you have. So the majority of our budget on the spending side is salaries, benefits, and purchase service. And if you remember from last week, that purchase service amount is from the educating of those choice students who choose to leave Akron Public Schools. So that's open enrollment, community, and charter schools. Taking a note here, purchase service percentage. All right. Now compare and contrast the chart on the right to the revenue chart. Looking where my cursor is now, the historical average annual 5-year change. We've run about 3% average annual growth rate on expenses compared to, I believe, the revenue side, which was 2.6%. Here. Now looking forward 5 years with the current assumptions in place, we're looking at 3.5% average annual growth rate. Here's where we need to pause and say, is 3.5% compared to a 1% growth rate on revenue sustainable? Absolutely not. It's not sustainable. And so what's driving that? The superintendent and I had a conversation today about the benefit side of our equation. If you look in the detailed forecast report that got emailed out prior to the weekend, you see probably a large jump, or what seems to be larger jump, in the benefits line item, and you see a little bit of it reflected here. So I'm leaving that note the same. I'll give you a little bit of my details to see if I can show that.
Hey Ryan, a quick question. So that 3.5. So for example, that 3.5%, that's the average annual growth rate on the expense side. Is that adjusted for inflation? Similar question with the annual revenue growth. Is that, so that 1%, is that basically sort of the nominal number that we're talking about?
So inflation on the expense side can be reflected in two different ways. Good question. One is on salaries and benefits. On salaries, we don't know what salaries will be 5 years out, but we do know what they will be 2 years out. So we do know the inflationary number associated with a couple of years of salaries. We know, generally speaking, what our inflationary number will be like +1 on health insurance. For all other areas of spend, there are individual inflationary numbers assigned to that, anywhere from 1 to 3%, and they're by category. It doesn't automatically assume everything just increases at 3%, but there's a blend of both, Dr. Hall, a blend of what we actually know in bargaining contracts, from steps to cost of living increases that are in current contract to future inflationary numbers. Now, go ahead. I can hear you.
Yeah. So for example, if we were just talking about salaries and benefits, because we know for the next 2 years what those costs are going to be, as far as negotiating for the contract. If you said that my salary and benefits, my average annual growth was 3.5%, that would be inclusive of those of the new negotiated rates with our bargaining units, right?
That's correct. And that
okay.
makes,
So in that case, then so then in that case, it is adjusted for inflation, essentially. So that number is adjusted. Okay, gotcha. Okay.
both actual and future estimates and assumptions.
Okay.
And to that point, obviously, comparing our revenue +5 of 0.9 or of 1% and our expenses of 3.5, it's not sustainable. And if you remember from our early days as a team together, when we were writing on the chart, we saw the expense versus revenue graph. This is how schools are funded, unfortunately. Our revenue generally doesn't keep up with our expenses. Especially in COVID-19, we need to start asking the questions of how do we address that by right-sizing, downsizing those expense side of the equation.
Roger that. Thank you. Yeah, and that to your point, that graph is etched in my retinas. So thank you.
Thanks so much. Etched in your retinas. Okay. Can I quote you on that?
Yeah, please go for it.
Okay. I call it the alligator graph. So maybe that'll be a little
right.
a little comic added to it, because as the expense and the revenue widen, the less a board deals with it, the harder the close is going to be. Maybe that's a little. All right, we'll move on.
Okay.
So, all right, so let's talk about our response to COVID-19. And I want to bring up another presentation. All right, can you see in a crisis of known unknowns? Do we see that chart?
No, I still see the year-over-year dollar and percentage change.
I don't see it either.
Okay.
Okay, now, okay, yeah, I see how you're toggling. You got like 6 different things up. One of them did say the one did say the known and unknown, but that's not the one that you're currently stopped on.
Yeah,
All right,
I
I want to make
saw
sure.
it flash on there, but then it didn't stay.
Okay, you see response to COVID-19.
Nope, I still see that spreadsheet with the benefits of total expenditures, etc.
I don't see it either.
Okay, hold on. I want to make sure that.
And sometimes there's a delay between sort of you changing your screen and the software keeping up with you. That might be what it is too, right?
Yeah, I just need to get this down for tonight, because some of these are okay. So looks like I'm back to entire screen. Oh, I see. It's on this one. Here, hold on. Okay, so I'll share that. Okay, now do you see the response to COVID-19?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Okay, well, now I can toggle back between a couple of PowerPoints that I've got running here. So the response to COVID-19 as we look forward, what do we know? So for us, FY21 and back to March 13th of this year, We know the CARES Act provided us about $10.7 million, of which 1.2 needs to be transferred to our non-publics. We've talked about that. Those are for services that we're required to provide to our non-publics. They follow Title I guidelines, and they primarily employ tutors, and it is a pass-through. Schools are operated as a pass-through, as you know, for both community and charter school and for our non-publics. And if you guys want more detail in the public session about that, just give me a high sign and we'll go into detail with that. On the expense side of the equation, we know that the governor announced $300 million of cuts to K-12 education. Akron Public Schools will see about a 3.5% or $3.5 million budget reduction, where we were earlier anticipating a $7 million budget reduction. And thankfully, the work between the Department of Education, their leadership board, and the governor's office, they adjusted that target reduction by a wealth factor. And so those districts that were in higher need received about half as much a cut as those districts that are higher wealth. So we appreciate that consideration. So putting into perspective, again, from our notes from last week, 3.5 million represents about 1% of our budget. But in all honesty, I do not expect $9.5 to $9.8 million to carry us through all the way through next year without substantial budget reductions from the state of Ohio. That's what we know. Now, do you see an extra slide called "In a Crisis of Known Unknowns"?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. So here's some priorities. These next two slides really should frame how we move forward together on this. Normally, we produce a 5-year forecast. We look out 5 years. We have bargaining contracts where we know, and we make some assumptions in years 3, 4, and 5. They're more trend oriented. We don't really count on the finite numbers. We pay much more attention to it when we're in this downward cycle like we were prior to COVID-19, where we're starting to deficit spend, and we'll talk about that at the end. So we have almost a crisis-driven focus on year 1 and 2. Like I said, this forecast is not going to be twice a year now. It's going to be monthly. And in monthly finance committees, we should be taking a hard look at our cash position. We should be really careful about any model-driven speculative changes. We should reflect on those together. We should reflect on those with our bargaining groups. And for our new board members, when I started 5 years ago, I started to meet with all of our bargaining groups regularly as it relates to the forecast so that they can see the assumptions and question them too. Just with an underscore that this is the district's forecast, not Ryan's forecast. And then instead of kind of looking quarterly, maybe 6 months and sometimes out 2 years on our cash position, we should start stress testing our cash reserves every month. And where it says in advance of borrowing needs, I think we've hit in Finance Committee that January and June and July as some of our cash flow tight months. If there's going to be issues, we need to have a real close eye on those before they happen. And then just to keep that framing and filter right for the board as we move into these potential unknowns, is we should look for data-driven right sizing. And through the superintendent, we will evaluate every position, every contract, every purchase service contract, every gas purchase, and look for opportunities through attrition to address a budget. And then finally downsize. If there are needs where we cannot raise additional revenue through a levy in the future, depending on when we put that on, and or there could be substantial budget reductions, 10% or more, then we would downsize. But this, I'll stop there and get your thoughts on this. And I guess I'm asking for your thoughts tonight. Its placement. Do you think it's relevant? Would it rather come more from the board into the superintendent too?
I think it's relevant, Ryan. I said one quick clarifying question. So that $3.5 million we're talking about, that was for fiscal year 2020. Do we know, Ryan, or just knowing when we're going to find out what the actual cut's going to be for fiscal year 2021?
We don't. There's a lot of speculation between next week and October. We don't know.
Oh, okay. So it could be. So you're saying it could be October before we find out, as late as October.
It's possible. I don't think it'll last that long. But at a meeting last week, I heard that date come up, and I said that's not possible. I
right.
would imagine that if the state knew, here's how I believe the state will respond, or how I would do it if I was in their position. I would apply a reduction factor starting July 1, as early as the next few weeks, that I know I will need to make up. 3%, 5%, 10%, whatever that number is, so that every district has the opportunity to plan in advance of the next school year. And then I would mid-year course correct if necessary. Maybe revenues are coming back stronger than we all anticipated at the state level. Fine. So we will lessen the amount of that reduction, or maybe it's worse than we thought. And then the governor and State Board of Education can process further reductions with a long enough runway that we can plan further.
So that, practically speaking, Ryan, that might be a point to kind of to touch on tonight too. The uncertainty around the timing and whether or not, because it sounds like, for example, if they don't make a decision, does our sort of monthly allocation go back to what it was pre-cut while we're waiting to find out what the cut for 2021 is going to be?
That's a great
question. Or are they going to continue? Okay, because I'm like, well, because to your point, like we know that they're cutting us for May and June, but in the absence of an announcement around what the budget cuts me for 2020, my sense would be that we go back to our regular payments July 1. To your comment around applying a reduction factor, so saying here are some funds that we may have to not pay back per se, but basically have to account for later on. So we may look better the early part of fiscal year 2021 while we're still waiting to find out what the cut's going to be.
That's right. That's a great point.
So that might be something that's worth maybe sort of just pausing on tonight, as it relates to, because again, people might say, well, when are you going to know about right sizing or downsizing or whatnot, and that's where like, well, we don't necessarily know because we don't know when the state's going to announce what the cut's going to be for 2021. That's just me thinking out loud. So because a lot of folks will have heartburn over the uncertainty. I wouldn't want to see us kind of be, kind of the scapegoat for that.
I agree. I think if the community understands how little information we have to make accurate forecasts, I think that's information they should have so that they understand that with regard to your office, Ryan, that you're doing the best you can with the information you have, and you can only make so many reasonable predictions or assumptions when you just don't have the information.
Right. Okay. Yeah, put a note in there to capture that tonight. But again, during the presentation, please stop me. Make those points too. Here's some other priorities that we need to keep an eye on in both the board and finance committee. State of Ohio financials. I'm reviewing the governor's updates, the sales and income tax and auto sales. monthly numbers as they're released. And that's a great indicator of what kind of pressure is going to be put on the governor and administration and how timely it will be in terms of what kind of reduction we'll see. Just so you know that we've got lots of folks around the state looking at past recession impact on withholding taxes. And so obviously the big hit is on income taxes right now, in sales, and less on property. On the property side of the equation, I anticipate that there will be a higher rate of delinquencies, but I'm not ready to put it in my forecast yet. Again, another reason to open up and engage our stakeholders, you and everybody in that process, because we won't know that until the fall. Till the fall tax bills go out, we really won't know what kind of delinquency rates and if it will be substantial to our budget. And you see here some guidance that reinforces the previous slide about known unknowns. We just need to continue to monitor each other and assumptions that we make. So don't we overreact to something that we really don't have good feeling for. And then stress test our cash on a monthly basis. And then that concept, a little bit more detail, right sizing, downsizing. And that gives you a little bit more detail. Non-programmatic operating. And again, this is just so the community at large knows how we're going to proceed and our staff. And then right sizing, this may be programmatic in the future. And then the unfortunate possibility someday if the cuts are very deep or we're unable at a point in the future to produce new revenue would be cuts and programmatic cuts. Up on your screen, hopefully you see revenue, expenses, and cash balance. Does everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. So just to put into perspective here, the kind of money that we're talking about, 1 month's payroll is $15 million, and GFOA recommends a minimum cash balance of no less than 2 months and 60 days operating cash. I believe Dr. Hall asked this question in Finance Committee. So we did a little bit of refreshing on this cash balance to benchmark comparison. As you're taking all of those numbers in, just to keep in mind that our forecast is going to go from a $22 million balance in that year 3 to a $17 million balance, not including any additional statewide budget cuts. We know that we got a 3.5% budget reduction from the state of Ohio yet for this school year. And so I just want to, I want to anecdotally highlight what kind of a period of uncertainty we are in, to Mrs. McKittrick's point about, well, what does 1% mean? But let me ask a question. Question is, do you think that we're doing a reasonable job if we're 99% accurate on our revenue? And do you think that we're doing a reasonable job if we're 99% accurate on our expenses? I believe so, right? At least from forecasting trend, and when you compare year over year and trying to build a rapport with your employees to say, well, how close are you in your forecasting? Well, what's 1%? Well, 1% wrong on revenue is $3.5 million, or 1% wrong on expenses is $3.5 million. If they're in the opposite direction, that's $7 million. And so I want to have that $7 million in your head as we look at the next few slides. In fact, let's go to the next one so that you can see the difference between the October forecast and the May. Does everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay. You see in October of 2019, which was the 1920 school year, we were predicting a $1.8 million deficit. Therefore, we were forecasting that we were not able to quote unquote balance the budget. Once COVID-19 happened, as you know, we were taking a look at month-over-month expenses. We're running a little bit under budget. Here's what's changed to have us deposit a $3.6 million deficit and a $17 million cash balance, and an increasing trend here. That $3.5 million budget is reflected here, and we've begun to see an increase of unemployment claims. And if you read the detailed report, you saw that the benefits ramps up pretty substantially from 20 to 21. And we're anticipating approximately 7 figures of unemployment claims expense, which will hit our books. We think that's a pretty reasonable adjustment. We may have to adjust it down and unfortunately up as well. And again, we'll have to revisit this monthly, but that's why we're going to take a $3.6 million deficit for the close of school. We are running a little bit more under budget in some areas, but like we said, we need to close the month of May to really get a handle on May and June about how much those potential under budget amounts are going to be. I want to leave you with one last chart. Yeah, please.
You know, it's funny, you asked a question earlier about the 1%. You know, I guess where my mind went when you asked that question was to the auditor standard around materiality being, what was it, 7%?
That's right.
Yeah. So what? Yeah. So 1% sounds fairly excellent to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And even then, right? So I want to be 100% accurate, especially when we're making future decisions on right-sizing non-programmatic, right-sizing programmatic, and potential cuts. That's why we need to keep all of each other in check to make sure we don't overreact. We do not put in a 10% cut in the forecast until we absolutely know it. But I do want you to see what a one-time 10% budget reduction looks like. So back up to our revenue charts. If you look at unrestricted and restricted aid, representing, let's go back to that percentage, about 60% of all of our revenue comes from the state. This is what a 10% one-time reduction looks like. See, we go from 22 million in October to 17 million in May to minus 2.7 million with a 10% reduction. That's not to say that I'm estimating we will receive a 10% reduction, but as our other government counterparts are around the state of Ohio, who've received a 20%, I think it's not unreasonable for us to model it.
Hey Ryan, can you run through those numbers one more time? I'm sorry.
Right. I'll back up one slide. So the third year out that we see a positive cash balance on October's forecast was 22 million.
Yeah.
In May, with the state budget reduction and some increased benefits around unemployment expense, we're forecasting a 17 million in the third year. Applying what we know today and a one-time 10% reduction to next year's state aid budget, just one time, so it's not cumulative, we're looking at a balance of minus 2.7 million. That's how significant a 10% reduction in state aid could look like. And it would elevate that priority of right-sizing, downsizing, probably to the third point right away. Now, COVID-19, right, it's just important for me to end on this point. COVID-19 has only exacerbated the problem that we were in. It is our time for revenue needs, whether it's November or some future date. We were overdue, right? Every 6 years on average, we've come back to the public is when our financial formula says that we come back for new revenue. We're at 8. So we stretched those dollars. We've right-sized before. We've reduced our operating footprint to lower our expenses. But when you add in the COVID-19 crisis, this is what it potentially can look like. And then I close the presentation with questions back to you and for discussion now and for the future. What other scenarios do we need to consider? Do we need to look at program cuts now and over the summer? Obviously, we have a coming discussion on a potential levy in both in November or May or out sometime next year. I think we've successfully answered how this forecast is different than others. And then we got to keep a close eye on property values. And if we have any indication coming into the fall that property values will start to decline again, that would be another reason to update the forecast, because then we have, 80, then we'll have 90% of our revenue at risk if we do have local property tax deflation. Okay, again, since this is Finance Committee, I want to ask, what other points do we want in this presentation? I've taken some notes on CPI, purchase service percentage, and the uncertainty and timing of budgets. We're just—
Hey, Ryan, this is Derek.
Yeah.
Hey, Ryan, I just had a clarifying question from earlier. So you mentioned that we had originally anticipated an appraisal bump. I think you said for the first time since 2008. What did we anticipate that bump being in real terms?
I don't know off the top of my head. That's something that I can find for us tonight.
No. I mean, I don't know that it's, yeah, I don't know that it's relevant for tonight per se. But I just was thinking, well, gosh, if we, if 30% of our revenue is from real estate, and we've seen appraisal bump, I mean, ballpark, would that translate into an additional $3.5 million, $7 million, $10 million in revenue to us in fiscal year 2021?
It would certainly not mean 10 million, but it could be 3 to 5 million.
Okay. So again, not a huge number.
It's not going to be a substantial change in that number, no.
Okay. And then the other question I had is when you were walking through there, so on your last slide there with the sort of the Q&A.
Yeah. What other questions?
So with the 10% cut, you showed I think in 2022 or 2021 that negative $2 million number. I guess as I was digesting what you were talking about, I was thinking, well, if we were going to talk about a levy, what would be the lowest amount we would need to plug, for example, that 2021 or 20? Again, I don't remember. It was the previous slide you had that kind of show what that negative number was. But you said that a negative 10% cut. Yeah, it was 2022. A negative 10% cut would result, all else being equal, to us being, in the red by almost $3 million by 2022. So the question then becomes, well, what would be the minimum levy amount that we'd have to ask for to ensure, that we were in the black at least through 2022? Because 2023, that's a huge number. That's 35 million. So I'm assuming that whatever we talk about millage wise, that there'd be a jump from 2022 to 2023, and probably an even bigger jump to 2024. But again, if this is going to come up potentially tonight, and maybe there's something that, and maybe we stay away from this tonight, but I'm just trying to think about sort of, okay, what kind of millage are we talking about? Are we talking about, all right, to maintain, financial integrity through 2022, we've got to be asking for 3.5, 4.5 mils, just to shore up 2022. I'm sorry, through 2022. And, if we're showing up through 2023, that's 7.5 million. Again, it's not something that necessarily we need to have on hand for tonight. Again, and we could talk about this next week as well. But that's where my head is at, is thinking about sort of, what millage amounts would we need to be asking for to plug some of these gaps that you're talking about.
I think the way that I would answer tonight, I think it is relevant, without mentioning specific millage amounts. I think the way I would answer is, we were already looking at operating needs, and the last two operating levies that we looked at were 7.9 mils. Of course, that kind of millage would clear our cash balance in 2022 and add about $17 million a year. But COVID-19's headwind to this might not get us 3 years with a 10% cut with that kind of millage. And then I would kick it to you and say, that's a great discussion for future levy discussions.
Gotcha. Okay.
Good question. What other questions or comments can you give me prior to tonight, or do you think we're pretty good? I will shorten it a little bit. We're probably looking at about 35, 40 minutes. Hate to do that, everybody on the financial and the numbers, but I think this one deserves a little bit more time and attention than what we normally do on a 5-year forecast.
Well, I was thinking too, Ryan, that I know that typically on the boards and that there's a financial committee sort of update. I don't know that we necessarily need to have a financial committee update. I'll defer to Diana as well. But if we're spending all this time tonight in the regular meeting sort of walking through this, to me, I think that kind of takes the place of the update. So, I don't know, Diana, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, so maybe during the presentation, we have some kind of some thoughts of those questions or points yourself. Please make them. To the extent, I'm presenting it, but if there's an anecdotal component to it, or question or discovery that you've had along the way, I think that only makes this a stronger presentation. So I guess, to follow along with that, let's make this our finance report. We've been studying this. I would say that you guys have probably been on the biggest crash course school funding update that I've ever seen. You've elevated it to twice a month. So yeah, please jump in.
Okay.
Well, that's all I had. Any other? We're just shy of an hour, Superintendent. That answered those benefit questions pretty well. Okay. Great.
Yes.
Okay.
Hey, Ryan, just as a point of emphasis tonight, when you're, again, I'm always trying to put my community hat on and think about, okay, if I was just sitting near this, I think the point you started with about this 5-year forecast, is really the legal backing to all of our contracts. I think that's a pretty powerful point to make.
Okay.
As far as setting up the rest of the presentation. So that way people understand sort of why this is so important. This is that if you're going to tune in for the meeting tonight, don't let your eyes glaze over on this particular portion. Here's why. So
The alligator graph.
Right, exactly. The etched in retina. So kind of thing.
Okay, that's a good point. Okay. Excellent. Well, thanks for tuning in, and I will see you here in about 2.5 hours.
All right,
Thank
that
you,
sounds
Ryan.
awesome.
Yes,
All
Valerie.
right, thanks. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
Take care all. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.